So hey guys, Milhouse of Sand and Fog is the third episode of season 17, and it first aired on the 25th of September 2005. It was directed by Stephen Dean Moore, and it was written by Patrick N. Verone. It is a pretty wacky relationship-driven story, and the plot goes from The Simpsons being the A-plot to the Van Houtens being the A-plot, and then back to The Simpsons being the A-plot. The story mainly follows Bart and Milhouse trying to get Milhouse's parents to split up after they get back together, but they instead accidentally break up Homer and Marge. I think this one is going to be interesting, as I honestly hate the Van Houtens as characters. I think they are the worst family in Springfield. So let's deep dive into this plot and answer if this story is good or bad. The episode begins with the Simpsons at church, and Maggie is scratching like mad. They go to the AME church to find Dr. Hibbert, and he diagnoses her with chickenpox. Now, this is the inciting incident, I guess, at least for Homer and Marge's story. This is what I mean by the narrative switching between the A and the B plots, because this sort of acts as the inciting incident for Milhouse's story too, but I wouldn't quite say it is. Homer gets the idea from Flanders to set up a pox party, and a bunch of kids come to catch the chickenpox from Maggie. Kirk arrives, and then Luann arrives, and the two get back together eventually. Also, Homer gets the chickenpox. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here just alone. So I think there's a strong case that the pox party is the inciting incident for Milhouse's story. But if we see this story through Bart, then Milhouse catching his parents getting back together is the inciting incident. Also, I don't get the point of Homer even getting the chickenpox. It doesn't serve as anything to the story, at all, apart from maybe, I guess, humour. Homer literally is cured as soon as Marge and Homer split up. It would have been better if they used this time to actually develop the split between Marge and Homer, or the Luann and Kirk stuff, or Milhouse or Bart, anything really. They really have too many characters here they're trying to balance, I think. Anyway, moving on. Kirk and Luann tell Milhouse they are getting back together, and at first, he is in heaven. This, I guess, is plot point 1 for Milhouse. Maybe you could say it's later when he realises his parents won't spoil him as much. Anyway, Milhouse complains to Bart that he isn't being spoiled as much, of course, and Milhouse and Bart decide to break them up. Actually, this is actually our plot point 1, for sure. It comes way later than it should, but this really shifts the story into gear and shifts us into the second act. Lisa, Bart and Milhouse watch the OC on TV, and they get the idea to plant a bra to make Luann think Kirk is cheating. The bra planting is definitely the midpoint, as it acts as the no return point for both Homer and Marge, and in some case Kirk and Luann. Luann finds the bra and sees a convenient name tag on it. I would call this out as plot convenience, but honestly I think it's within Marge's character that she would name tag her own bras. It would have been better if maybe they pointed this fact out earlier on in the episode, but it's no big deal, it just would have made the story feel better woven. Luann brings the bra to Homer, and after painfully explaining it to him, Homer believes that Marge has cheated. He confronts her about it and she tells him to leave. This is our plot point 2, for sure, as it sends us into the third and final act, and I gotta say that Act 3 is pretty damn long. Homer lives on the streets and Lisa convinces Bart to admit to Marge that he is responsible for the bra, but it doesn't really do much. Bart, Lisa and Milhouse try to come up with a plan in the treehouse, and Bart gets a genius but stupid idea. He gets Homer and Marge to meet up by a river, and then on top of a cliff, he plans to throw a doll that resembles him to get Marge and Homer back together. Milhouse, however... I actually hate Milhouse. Milhouse knocks Bart down into the river. After taking a few likely fatal hits, Bart begins to drift down the river and Homer jumps in to save him. Eventually, Marge also then needs to save Homer. This is our climax, and it ends the main conflict. Marge and Homer decide to get back together, and this serves as a nice resolution. The episode ends with Milhouse falling into the river, a pretty funny joke to end the episode on, and it's also very sitcom-like. They really try to force this theme of trust. Marge is mad that Homer doesn't trust her enough to take her at her word when he asks her if she cheated. Then in the climax, when Homer and Bart are clinging to that rock, they wedge in this trust aspect again. I do think it's a little forced. It doesn't really feel organic. If they wanted to do this, then they could have done something earlier to establish that Homer has trust issues with Marge, but I don't know if I ever got that impression from Homer. It would feel a little bit like a retcon. The plot pretty much abandons Milhouse, Kirk and Luann during the third act. We don't even know how the bra affected Luann and Kirk. We don't even get one scene for it, in fact. This is my biggest issue with the plot overall. It starts as a Simpsons family-centric story, then it leads into a Milhouse-centric story, and then back to a Simpsons family story. It's a little all over the place. Personally though, I'm not too bothered that. I think it works overall. I just don't like the trust theme, nor do I like the fact we don't get no follow-up for Kirk and Luann. But as far for the switch itself, give it a pass. Overall, the plot is a little loose, but I think it's got good aspects. I like the bra setup and fail, and I also do like the elaborate climax scene, although it's a little bit silly. The stuff in between though is kinda hit or miss for me. Maybe the jokes will smooth this episode out. Let's see. Okay, so I like the humour in this episode overall. It's nothing amazing, but I don't think it's mediocre or bad. My favourite joke is from Homer. You know the 4 seasons? Well, I'm experiencing them firsthand because I'm living in the park. It's a pretty clever joke. Actually, it's too clever for Homer, I think, but I don't know. It's cool. Another good joke from Homer is, I bought it for her boobs. I don't know, it's kind of dumb, but I chuckled. Something about how innocent Homer sounds in that scene is kind of funny. I'm not a big fan of the Kirk humour. Maybe it's because I don't like Kirk, but the cologne sample thing is just really sad. I didn't really find it funny at all. I did like the sea captain joke though. That one was okay. I think the humour overall is good. Lots of good jokes here. A couple are a little lame, but I feel like the humour is there. Homer and Marge breaking up kind of reduces some of the humour. It's kind of a downer situation, but I still think the humour in this episode is still somewhat good. This episode balances a lot of characters in it, so there are a lot of opportunities for jokes here. Let's look at those characters. So it gets a little confusing choosing the protagonist for this episode. The episode's title implies it's Milhouse, but we do get a lot of stuff with Marge and Homer. Kirk and Luann also have their moments too, but I don't think the protagonist is Marge and Homer, or Kirk or Luann, or even Milhouse. I think the protagonist is Bart. He causes the bra thing, Homer and Marge saving him is the climax. He's just too active in the story not to be the protagonist. He causes a lot of the things that happened. He isn't too active earlier on, but there is an argument the whole chicken pots thing is just an opener and a setup. The conflict doesn't really start until Milhouse decides he wants his parents to break up again. Saying that, this episode doesn't really feel like a Bart-centric story. The plot points are more important for Marge and Homer and Milhouse, but Bart does act as the protagonist. Bart doesn't get any new huge perspective or anything, but I found it interesting he toys with the idea that Homer and Marge breaking up is a good thing, but in the end he knows they must get back together. This is certainly a story arc for him. It's not too much there, but at least it's something. Milhouse on the other hand is the opposite. He comes to believe that his life is just way better when his parents are apart. It's sad to think about, but maybe Milhouse is right. The only issue I have with this aspect is the way they frame it. They frame it in a way where Milhouse is getting the best of both worlds, but I always had this impression that Kirk is kinda useless. I think he needs a partner to keep him on his tracks. Kirk doesn't really get anything new, to be honest. It's more just of the same. Most of Kirk's character is, ha, look at this loser. This is mainly why I've never really liked Kirk as a character. To me, he's always just felt very surface level, despite being a large focus in many episodes. Luann, I think, is similar in this regard. We don't get any deep dives into her character either. It also kind of feels that she goes back with Kirk just because. There isn't any real reason to it. Marge and Homer, on the other hand, do get some character moments here and there, but my biggest issue is the trust theme. I never got the impression that Homer deeply distrusts Marge. I feel like Homer was totally reasonable in that scene in the kitchen. Maybe he shouldn't have been so vitriolic, but the evidence seemed to have pointed that Marge had an affair. I really like how Homer and Marge work together in that climax scene. Really shows how well they work as a team. Overall, I think the characters in this episode are a bit of a mixed bag. I like the stuff they did with Milhouse. Actually, something about him realising his parents are better off apart made him really mature, actually. And I just wish the reasoning was a bit more selfless than selfish. Bart has a little arc, as do Homer and Marge, but they don't really feel substantial. Anyway, I've talked enough about this episode, let's move on to the score. Overall, I think Milhouse of Sand and Fog is a good episode. This episode is pretty jam-packed overall. We have the chickenpox stuff, Kirk and Luann getting back together, Marge and Homer split. I think they really could have dropped the chickenpox thing, being honest. It does serve as a way to get Kirk and Luann back together, but they could have done something that was way shorter and way more efficient. Some of the conflict seems a bit forced. There is a nice sentiment in Marge and Homer coming back together at the end though. The humour is a good thing for the most part, and the characters certainly don't have amazing arcs, but they do have something at least. The structure is a bit all over the place. There is no obvious protagonist, but I don't think the structure is a big issue with this episode. Act 3 is a little too long, but apart from that, I'm kinda cool with it. Okay, so that's all my thoughts kind of in a nutshell. In conclusion, I'm gonna give Milhouse of Sand and Fog a solid 6 out of 10. Now, let's move on to the wheel. So, the next episode we will be reviewing is... Let's have a look. That episode will be... Marge versus the Monorail. Hey, that was the one I put in.